Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro.
I'm Alicia Garcia Herrero.
And today we will discuss about the concept of Sinofuturism and how tales about the future play an important role in shaping China's economics, politics, and society. This episode is part of Bruegel's focus on global China as seen from Europe, which includes our monthly newsletter, ZhōngHuá Mundus, to which we invite you to subscribe. The link is in the show notes. Joining us today from Shanghai is Wanzhou Liu, who is a scholar in comparative literature specialized in Chinese science fiction at the University College of London. Wanzhou, thanks for connecting with The Sound of Economics.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Thank you very much for having me in this place. Thank you.
I would like to start our conversation by introducing the concept of Sinofuturism, which was originally developed by Lawrence Lick, who is a German-born of Malay-Chinese descent. His basic message is, while Europe is stuck in the past, China leaps into the future. However, with a caveat, in the anxious eyes of the Europeans, the superpower represents the fully automated world of tomorrow, found in products, server farms, and artificial intelligence. Somehow, Sinofuturism confronts us all as well with some sort of inhuman dystopia. On one hand, the concept can be judged as crafted from a European point of view, showing the fears and also the perceptions about China. On the other hand, it is a concept that resonates with visions for the future portrayed by the official discourse of the government, private companies, and also science fiction. Wanzhou, what can you tell us about how the intersection of all these narratives converges into the concept of Sinofuturism, and how would you further elaborate this concept to explain it to our listeners?
Okay, thank you, Giuseppe. Sinofuturism is a really popular term recently, and people, not only in science fiction studies, but also in other fields of a lot of other disciplines, they are all talking about this term. And this makes this term very difficult to define in the first place, actually. So actually, it's a shame of mine that I didn't read the Lawrence Lick's original article on his definition of Sinofuturism. But if what he said, it's kind of, the China in the future and Europe in the past, I tend to disagree with him because we are not talking about the linear time. We're not talking about, the future is the future and the past is something happens in the history. Actually, I believe what Sinofuturism or futurism talks about is an overlap of our imagination of what to come and our understanding of our history of what was in the past. So I think there's a duality between the two ends of the same spectrum. That is what we are talking about right now. We have some elements feels like futuristic, but we also have some elements that can keep us memory in the past. And also Sinofuturism, if we look at the term itself, it divides into two parts, right? Sino, which means China, related to China, and also futurism. So that leaves us some questions. So this can be futurism in China, of China, or around China, and also it maybe not only contemporary China mainland, it can also other places that share some, Chinese elements. So that means when we talk about the Sinofuturism, we're probably not only talking about, which is all Chinese science fiction, which right now is super popular, and we are also talking about a Chinese mode or Chinese characterized mode of thinking something, so thinking the alternatives. So that leads us to the science fiction itself and futurism. We're talking about the future. We're talking about something different. That something different is from something that is different from our reality. So whenever we are talking about futurism, we are talking about the reality as well. So we are talking about what is, because we can see lots of problems, lots of troubles we're facing every day right now. We had enough of it. We need something to improve. We need something to, to give us a different sense of life, of the world. So for some people, that is called a sense of not yet. a sense of not yet. So we are imagining the not yet, we are imagining the future. And that kind of futuristic imagination is solidly rooted in our perception of what we're having right now, right here. So I think that's my understanding of the Sinofuturism itself.
So what you're saying, there are a couple of very interesting elements, especially for our reflections here at ZhōngHuá Mundus. On one hand, there is an aspect about Sinofuturism or anything related to a discourse about the future, which is here in the present. So this is one aspect that I would like to dwell on, first of all, because this is not something that concerns only science fiction, as you say, but concerns as well the other realms. And then there is a second aspect where science fiction comes in, and I would like to dig in more in the second part of our podcast, where, as you say, you can imagine a reality that is not yet there, or like imagine an alternative reality. So we would like to see a bit which are those kind of visions for alternative versions of the future of China, which might be found in science fiction at the moment. And perhaps it's one of the places to look in order to see on this alternative crafting of a different narratives. But before going to this, and here I would like to get Alicia on the mic for that, going back to this view about this discourse about the future, which is at the moment embedded into the current narratives of China or in China, for example. How would you think that there is such a link, between this, which sounds more literary and let's say out there, with something that might be more familiar with our bread and butters of policy discussions when we speak about, I don't know, I'm just thinking over there out of my mind, but for example, when we've been discussing about the Common Prosperity program here in our podcast, we pretty much had an analysis of some sort of discourse about the future. So how do you bring this discourse about the future into what we are discussing in our everyday analysis of politics and economics?
Well, thank you, Giuseppe. I think what we've heard so far is important because it shows that the whole idea is to look at your present and to imagine a better future. This is not only China, this is all of us. Yeah, I mean, but to me, the key difference with China is that a future is planned ahead much more than elsewhere. I mean, I'm not saying anywhere because, many countries have visions for 2030. This is the case of Saudi Arabia or others. Yeah, I mean, it's not only China, but in a way for us in Europe, we tend to have very blurred images of the future as far as our governments are concerned, because we're not a planned economy in essence. So because China indeed plans ahead, or China's government plans ahead, I think there's an idea of what the future should look like as planned, as opposed to what people have in mind of what their future should look like, which doesn't have to be exactly what, each person has been told it will be. And I think that's very interesting because not only because of the difference, but because maybe of the difference in what is not only expected, but what is covered in everybody's mindset. So what is the government saying the future will look like? First, the China dream. China dream, one could say, is this science fiction? Well, actually, so far, the Chinese government has actually generally managed to prove that quote-unquote science fiction, because it looks so difficult to achieve, right. And the next one is 2035. 2035 is where, according to the Chinese government, China should become a moderately developed economy with an income per capita of around $20,000 per capita. This brings China to nearly double Mexico or nearly double Turkey, basically out of the middle income trap. So that's one thing that to me would be interesting to hear, how do Chinese people perceive that? Is that enough? Or is that not enough? Because that's just a number, maybe they have other science fiction type expectations of their lives that have nothing to do with this number. So, I'm just trying to bring to the conversation the fact that while China plans ahead in terms of both their wealth, everybody's wealth, but also the model. The model is another thing that we know is that China is pushing to become actually a full socialist model with Chinese characteristics. So for me, the key here is, what do people think this will be and what do they expect to be? Which is very different from, or maybe not different, but that's my key question. What do Chinese people want to become? Whether it's real or science fiction wise, I don't mind. But I think it's important to discuss this topic. Yeah.
Thank you, Alicia. I think that's a really interesting topic. I think there's some artwork you might be interested in talking about Chinese looking into the future. Because generally speaking, there are two kinds of voices right now. So some people hold very positive into the future. And I think last year, there was a Sino-futuristic artwork went viral online. It became very popular. It's called the China 2098. So I think that's a kind of a series of painting that depicts what the artist imagines what will be happening in the year 2098. So basically, they painted huge buildings. You can imagine the socialist imagination, right? The huge buildings and also the huge infrastructures, and with slogans painted everywhere. Especially, I think there was even a narrative that guided all this kind of painting scatter, talking about their kind of global warming, sea level rising. So China has to build a lot of dams and to hold the seawater away and to protect the city and the people. And that style is really nostalgic because that reminds us of what happens in the 60s and 70s, and using all the slogans, all the nationalism. And that is what the artist thinks what will happen in probably in less than 100 years. And, that's one kind of voice, but that was really popular. So for that, I believe that echoes some nationalistic passion, especially in the online community. At the meantime, there's also another perspective, and probably the future is not that, promising, not that bright far into the future. And they are talking about some very severe and very troubled problem right now happening right now in China. And also they were also using some set probably in the near future city. And one of the very good example for this is a novel called Waste Tide, published in 2013. And that novel basically talks about the e-waste recycling and also the environmental pollution caused by that. And they are talking about the environmental degradation. They are talking about the toxic ecology happening because China was importing all this kind of e-waste and try to make money from it. And that was what China was doing in the 90s and early 21st century. So people start to rethink whether this is good for the environment, whether this is good for the community. And there are lots of things going on in that novel, but this is a very core or the essential setting of that novel. I think that represents the two voices. On the one hand, it's kind of everything was bright, everything was huge, was sublime. But on the other side, it's kind of a toxic sublimity. There's some toxic environment because of economic development that China has been witnessing since in the last few decades. So yeah, Alicia, your question is really interesting because I am very curious about that, the artwork, the China 2098. I think that means a lot for some people and for us to interpret what is happening, especially for us to understand the Chinese nationalism right now.
What you say, Guangzhou, also reminds me the words of Qiufan, who is, by the way, one of the most known Chinese science fiction writers. Actually, I think this is the author of
Waste the Tide. Yeah, that's his work.
Yeah, exactly. And he says something like science fiction is the greatest realism at the present time because it provides a window for imagination through its open realism to delineate a reality no mainstream literature has written about. So I think from this point of view, and that's exactly the reason why we asked you to come today to The Sound of Economics, it's exactly this. I mean, you can, through science fiction, somehow catch some trends. And what you are just saying, the nationalistic imaginary of the paintings, and on the other hand, the climate emergency are kind of two sides of this coin. Maybe you can help us and walk us through some other of these future imaginaries that will help us to understand also a bit better this wave of new Chinese science fiction, which basically we can look at in order to understand what Alicia's question has been so far, which is, are there multiple imaginations about China? Of course, we can hear and we analyze the official governmental policies, and this is as well, to a certain extent, crafting the future in the present in a way or another, which is always a little bit of a science fiction exercise, no matter who is doing it from their point of view. But also these kind of multiple imaginations, because it helps us a lot to understand what the Chinese today actually are thinking about themselves and project themselves.
Yeah, thank you, Giuseppe. For Chinese science fiction, the so-called mainstream Chinese science fiction right now, writers of that trend basically are still focusing on the darker side of the futuristic imagination. Like you mentioned, that Chen Qiufan is very famous in publishing West Tide, which is now, I think, especially in the domain of science fiction studies, the West Side has become one of the very important the texts of our discussion on environment, on climate change, and also on the economic structure that incorporate China as the world of factory and all the labor-intensive industry in China. So that makes China one of a very specific part in the world economy. And also people like the other very important figure is, I think, Han Song. His novel is really dark. It's just like a gothic story because there are lots of people dying, and also there are lots of eeriness, sense of weirdness going on in his novels. But there are lots of stories. A lot of works by Han Song all talks about some kind of a crisis hidden behind China's development. Because in the past 3 decades, in China was super fast, right? They're super fast in developing everything, and super fast in building stuff everywhere. But he noticed that in this kind of development, China actually has achieved another sense of a grand narrative that you can't be left behind. You have to follow up, and it is exactly such a sense of acceleration. People are alienated from their work, and also they have to work really hard and to get involved in the very fast rhythm, the Chinese rhythm. I think that's his understanding of China right now. Especially there's one short story published in around 2003 or 2004. It's called My Country Does Not Dream. So that echoes very much back to the Chinese Dream rhetoric, right? The Chinese Dream was proposed, I think, in the last decade by the current president about revitalizing the Chinese nation and to become great again. And Han Song talks about the same topic like a few years before this Chinese Dream, and he wrote a story about My Country Doesn't Dream. And in that novel, actually, so people sleepwalk during the night, and they still work. They still go to work. They still do a lot of things like what they do during the daytime, but they are not aware of it. So people are working for the daytime and they are sleepwalking during the night. And the common thing is they all contribute their labor power to develop a fast-growing economy. And I think that is really interesting, especially Han Song has noticed this 6 or 7 years before the Chinese Dream rhetoric in the 2010s, right? That's what I can think about the imagination of the Chinese science fiction right now. But I can guarantee there are lots of other people that are worth mentioning right now. But Chen Qiufan and Han Song is two of the very important, very representative ones, I think.
Another aspect that you actually analyze is the more political economy within these works, which is sometimes quite interesting to analyze the economic reality of today as well. You mentioned Waste Tide, and there I think there is a strong theme about migrant workers beside the climate theme. And then maybe we can say a couple of words more on how these works of science fiction not only reflect a general worldview, which is what we are discussing so far, but going more from the worldview to the kind of political economy of what is described there. And then I would like to see how we can hook it up with some of our economic policy teams, actually.
Yes, Giuseppe. Another very important theme of Tide is, like you said, is migrant worker. So because Tide is centered on a very specific town called Silicon Isle, and Silicon Isle is actually a literal representation of a lot of coastal Chinese cities, which takes migrant workers from other areas in China. And there's a lot of social tension going on between migrant workers and local residents right now, especially if we think about the hukou system in China, so the house registration system in China, where people, especially people's welfare provision is basically registered in the places where they were born. So if they move, they have got a new household or a new hukou in the new city. But for some times, especially in big cities in Beijing and Shanghai, that could be very difficult. That means the migrant workers are not treated equally with the local residents. So that makes them stuck in between of duality between social rejection and economic acceptance. So they are accepted but rejected. So they are accepted because of their labor force they provided, especially in the novel, they are the frontline workers dealing with waste stuff, and they are also the victim of the environmental risk that's provided, right? Because they have to touch all the pollutions. Also, their mental and their physical health are put in danger in that environment. So that makes them needed, in a way. And also in other, labor-intensive industry in other places in China, like the assembly industry, like the toy, like the many others. So they provide the labor. So they are needed because we all know China, made in China products, right? Made in China means cheap. And why is it cheap? Because the labor force is cheap. So they provide the labor force, the cheap labor force, which gives China sort of advantage in the world market. So they are accepted, they are needed, but they're still rejected because they are not treated as one of us in lots of cities. They are treated as migrants.
So one can say that such a kind of novel also is some sort of a critical account of what is going on in China. To a certain extent, it's something that we don't read in news commentaries within the normal mainstream China's media, maybe. But then we can somehow read between the lines of a science fiction novel. Is that a role that science fiction authors take on them, like this more kind of activist kind of role, and how this compares with the actual environment in which they are writing and so on?
I would say the science fiction writers, they are writing some critiques about the reality. So, and I think that can lead us to the nature of science fiction writing, because as I said at the beginning, science fiction is about the alternative. Because a lot of people think that science fiction is a children's literature, right? Science fiction is about the science popularization. So, which is not true actually, because science fiction is really political, and science fiction can provide some alternative imagination of what should have been, right? So it's not what to come, it's what should have been. So that means lots of science fiction writers, they are very critical about everything around them. So they can notice a problem and they offer some kind of a solution. It's not the true solution because there are lots of difference between reality and fictionality, right? But they attempt to think further and to think, if we don't have what we are having right now, so what is the replacement? What can we have instead? So I think that's what they are doing right now.
Alicia?
I think we are learning a lot about different ways to understand science fiction. I think, to be frank, the more you are offered, use that kind word, a vision of the future, the more you need other visions of the future, don't you? I mean, that's in a way natural, I would argue, because you get closer to using your own imagination to explore the difference between what you are told your future will be as opposed to what you may think or you may wish your future might be. So I think that's why, in my humble opinion, science fiction is such a, probably, and I may be wrong, but I feel that it's closer to the heart probably of Chinese people that maybe, it is today in the West, because it has this sense of different realities or virtual realities or, parallel realities. And in that regard, I like to push the argument a little bit more for other listeners as to what other economic reality, if I may say, or socio-economic reality China could become in, say, 2035. Let's focus on that year. In other words, I mean, we just heard about migrant workers. Maybe they, their futuristic vision of the world, or at least of their own reality, might be, I don't know, no hukou. I mean, I can move freely within my borders, as is the case in Europe. I'm not saying that Europe is the example, because there's so many other things Europe should actually think of changing. But I'm saying, in the light of the discussion, maybe, free mobility. And now, by the way, I was just commenting on this, because China is pushing what we Europeans call the single market. And, for some of our listeners, Giuseppe, this might be a surprise, because we always think China is already a very, very homogeneous kind of, economic area. And that's why they do so well, because, they have a huge market. We always say that, where they can experiment. But the reality is they're not a single market as far as labor is concerned, for the reasons that we just heard. Yeah, for example. So, one thing, putting it again in socioeconomic terms of what these parallel visions might be, is everybody can circulate freely, and there's no difference between migrant workers and other workers. For our listeners, this also means that they have access to the pension system, to the education system. It's pretty hard to be a migrant worker, I have to say, in China. So that could be one. But I was thinking, what about preferences in terms of the role of the digital economy? I want to hear about that as well. I mean, what are Chinese people's vision of what their life will be? Are they all very comfortable with a very digital and thus also sometimes intruding role of the digital economy? Or are there concerns starting to appear, and does that show in science fiction work? Meaning worries about, because I just Googled what you just said about China 2098, and it all looks like very appealing, this digital world and very socialist digital type society. But is there any strand in the science fiction literature that kind of worries about that? Because we do have that in Europe, and I'd like to hear your views about that. And sorry for the long comment.
No, that's a superb comment. I like that. And since you mentioned that a digital economy, actually the digital economy, I would like to divide the term into two parts. That is the platform economy, right? So that they are using digital platforms, right? And the other side is the video sharing, the content making online, like the TikTok. Everyone knows about TikTok. TikTok holds a very unique video sharing platform right now. So for the first part, I would say the platform economy is still dependent on the physical labors, especially the food delivery, and especially online taxi. So in Europe, it's a Uber, right? So in China, Didi is a similar one whatsoever. But that means at the same time, so both the customer and also the provider of the service, like the food deliverer. So we are both dependent on the platform, and the platform is trying to use the data and trying to use the algorithm to, they call it to monitor all this kind of economic process and maximize their working efficiency. But in the meantime, so we can see, especially in the food delivery industry right now in China, so there are very few protection on the workers themselves, because there are lots of legal contracts and legal documents that prevent the workers from asking for welfare from the major company, because they are outsourced. There are lots of complicated, legal issues going on right now. But the result of this is that if you got injured, if you got hit by a car while you were doing the food delivery, you can't really get any compensation from the company, because they have shed away all the legal risks. So that is one of the very important issues right now. So it's all the platform workers, and they are detached from their employer. They have nowhere to ask for help. And there are lots of them. There's a huge group in China because there are lots of China people have to order online. So there are lots of food drivers going on with the service. I think it's a very critical problem we are having right now is the social protection for this group of workers. And the other side is the example is kind of a TikTok. And the TikTok is really interesting because one of my friends is studying on TikTok and also about the data recommendation system of that software. So she told me that the software is monitoring everyone and they are collecting all the personal data and they try to build a profile with all this data. And the software is trying to manipulate people's behavior with the profile they're having. Because if you follow what the profile means, and that means you got lots of chances of recommendation to be recommended. And also the content sharing economy is established, built on that sharing system. So that means the data and the platform has become the subject of some kind of biopolitics. And that is what she told me. So I was really surprised by this because I don't know whether I have another digitalized profile of myself, which is more real than myself. So that is a very horrific imagination if I can think about it. So especially for that, and there are lots of science fiction works in China talking about this. Especially, let's talk about Chen Qiufan again. Chen Qiufan co-wrote a collection of stories with a entrepreneur called Kai-Fu Li. So he used to be a very important entrepreneur, especially in computer science. And he co-wrote with this computer scientist. And I think there are 10 stories going on in 10 cities. And Chen Qiufan was basically responsible for the fiction part. And in each of the fictions, there's kind of a new innovation, new technology implemented to change people's life. And Kai-Fu Li was taking part in explaining the technique and the mechanism behind all this kind of technological innovation. So that collection is called AI 2041. So I think there are 10 stories. And a Chinese version and English version was basically published at the same time. So for the listeners who are interested in this one, can check the story collection.
That's very interesting. I think that one of the major aspects that you are putting forward in this combination between the platforms and the data sharing is the big theme of surveillance, and how surveillance plays a role. And I think this chimes in also with the question of Alicia. So if I might be a bit more straightforward, how much surveillance is a theme in Chinese science fiction at the moment?
You mean for me?
Yeah, no, I mean, like how much do you think surveillance is a theme that is present in science fiction works at the moment?
Surveillance. There are some discussion about surveillance in China right now, but basically, a lot of them are written around the first decade of 21st century, because what happens in the recent 5 years. So we have a tightening of the, especially on the censorship stuff. And it's increasingly difficult, especially for writing, if you got everything on Word, so that means something different. But there are lots of stories, especially in the first decade of 21st century. And one of the representative one is called Ether. It's a story I can share with you through email and spelling of the work. And basically that was talk about there's kind of a technology or nanotech robot, and you can't see the robot, but it's in the air, and it can diverge what we see. For example, there's a slogan on the wall and talking about some bad things, but what you can see from through the media of that robot is kind of a good thing on the wall. So they can change what you see, and also they can change what you hear through a basic similar mechanism. So there are a group of people setting up a touching club, a touching community. For it means like you write on the other people's hand to transmit the information, and they can form a large circle of people and doing the same thing, and the other one hand is come to receive the information from the people, from the person behind you, and also there's the use another hand to send out the information from that person and to the next, and also you can add on your own thinking into the stream of discussion. So that is a very interesting session, especially talking about the surveillance. And I think there are another short story titled "Silent City" and written by Boyong, and basically they are a similar theme that you can't speak for certain things, and the only thing you can do is to do this privately, and that kind of a private space it becomes the target of the government's policing and government inspection and stuff. So I think there are some Chinese science fiction talking about the censorship and especially surveillance as well.
Just to interrupt you for a second, I want to ensure that to tell to everyone that in the show notes we are going to put all the references about some of the books that we are mentioning here, because this makes an extremely interesting reading list about those visions of the future. Guangzhou, we are going close to the end of this episode, but before leaving, I just would like to see if Alicia would have any final roundup about what do we make out of this. I mean, to me, this is all extremely work in progress in terms of looking at different aspects and looking beyond the official narratives that they are being crafted about the future, and bringing back this theme of the future. I think, I mean, if I challenge you, Alicia, because it seems to me that it's clear a major topic in China. It's definitely less of a major topic in Europe, but it is a major topic in China, and it challenges the core of the Chinese steam engine of development when we speak about the economics on that side. So it is something that perhaps we need to delve a little bit more into it to understand better. And also this, what Guangzhou has been telling us, this even the existence of alternative visions of the future per se through science fiction. I think it's an incredible, interesting tool to understand these patterns.
Giuseppe, I fully agree with you that if there is a place to go to learn more about people's own vision of the future, that's science fiction. But I have to say that what I've learned from this podcast is even in science fiction, I think our listeners need to understand that it is also a very powerful tool to depict a vision of China that aligns with this idea of the China dream, for which digitalization plays a very positive role. And therefore, I think only time will tell really what Chinese people think through science fiction or without, but I think through science fiction will be easier, what they really think about this future that has been depicted for them. And my sense is that while development is still very positively perceived in China, as growth, and which is already happening, turns lower, we already have what it was, less than that, probably a fourth at the end of this year of what it was in 2012. The clouds on this future depicted as socialism with Chinese characteristics through digitalization and other means might start to show some cracks in the science fiction world, and perhaps even beyond. But it will be hard for us to see it. And I think this is because it's not only about China, but also the model that China is for the rest of the world, especially the global South. So, what I'm trying to say here is that while we can learn a lot through science fiction, this is my personal reading of what I've heard, we should read science fiction for China, because that's the best source we can get But we should still take it with a pinch of salt, because we still need to realize that this is a very powerful tool for the Chinese government to show to the rest of the world what China will look like. So in other words, even if this is the best instrument we can have, we still need to put it in the light of its usefulness. And I think that's something that we can't avoid telling our readers today. That's all I want to say.
Thank you. And Guangzhou, how would you like to react to these final comments from Alicia, or counter-react to this? How we seeing different movements within the Chinese science fiction, a more governmental one, and maybe some more critical one? What should we watch in that space?
Yeah, I totally agree, actually. And science fiction, as I said, it's very political genre. And that means when especially when Chinese writers write science fiction, and what they have in mind is their critique and what they think about what is happening right now in China instead of what happens in the future. So they are using the current reality as a start point to build on something different and to build on something that could make us not only our life in China, but also the world of the life of the whole world, and to make the whole world into a better place. I think that is what they are doing right now. And I think that is totally, if you like to know something about Chinese economy, and you can either turn to the nonfiction writing, definitely, and you can turn to the mainstream. But one of the alternatives is the Chinese science fiction. So you can get some ideas about China's economy, and especially some problems of Chinese development in the past 3 decades. And so they can get the sense of overdevelopment, right? So you can get the sense of developmental unevenness between different regions in China. So as Alicia just said, China is not a single market, it's not a single place, and China is complicated. And there are some developed places and cities, but there are also some less developed regions left behind. And that unevenness is a reason for the migrant workers what we are having right now. So we have the problems. So if you're interested in China, especially in the recent years, and then Chinese science fiction probably will be a kind of a tool to understand what happens in China.
And as I said before, we're going to provide a list of Chinese Science Fiction 101 basics so that it can make a good reading list for our listeners of The Sound of Economics. And I would like to thank Guangzhou to join us once again from Shanghai. So this brings us to the end of this episode, which was part of Bruegel's focus on global China as seen from Europe, which includes as well a monthly newsletter, ZhōngHuá Mundus, to which we invite you to subscribe. The link is in the show notes. As usual, you can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website, www.bruegel.org. Guangzhou, Alicia, once again, thanks a lot for joining the conversation, and thanks to our listeners for following us. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.